from an IT perspective, right? It's a significant advantage. But then, the constant tug of war between quality compliance and IT or engineering is always that. I mean, hey, you have this latest and greatest tool, but what if it really lessens my compliance score? What if it leaves me exposed from a compliance perspective? The flip side of looking at it really is virtualization truly provides significant compliance benefits as well. Whether you look at it from a Part 11 perspective or from a business continuity perspective, obviously, backups and disaster recovery on a virtualization framework is significantly enhanced. You can just do a lot more with a virtual environment than you can with a physical environment. The other significant advantage is ongoing support for the just outdated hardware. You could have an application, and this is something that I've encountered in the past as well. There was a client, as a customer of ours, who had a particular application. This was really old VAX system, right? And the information was stored in tapes. Now, the whole system was hibernated for a while because it was, they exported from that to, migrated from that to another newer application. But they could not get rid of the VAX system only because it had data which they had to still support, and the data retention period hadn't gone away. So all of that information was stored in tape. And this wasn't very long ago. This was like 4 or 5 years ago. And the downside was that the system was so old that when you were actually, when you had to look at the data and you had to retrieve the data, it would destroy the tapes. So here you have an environment where you have a system where all of the information is stored, but to actually view the data would destroy the data. So you have a catch-22 situation. So that kind of stuff will never happen in a virtual environment because the virtual machines can be ported from one physical box to another physical box and can be maintained for a longer duration of time. And obviously, from a rapid provisioning of servers and workstations, it really helps from a validation and a compliance perspective because you're not waiting around for a development box to be built. You're not waiting around for a QA environment box to be built. You can really rapidly prototype and rapidly set up these environments. And for example, if you want to investigate an issue about a particular system that created some data 5 years ago or 4 years ago, you can actually go back 4 years, look at your change control, and you could have, and if your change control is robust enough, and you have an image of the environment, of the virtual environment or the virtual machines, you can actually bring that virtual machine back up, do some testing, do some investigation immediately. And this is something that you cannot do with production in a physical environment, only because you can't possibly get that same hardware again. You can't possibly find that image again and go back and set it up again. So, from a quality perspective or a compliance perspective as well, that's a huge advantage. So overall, I mean, there are significant advantages from a validation or a compliance or a QA perspective within virtualization. You can consolidate common infrastructure testing as part of the virtual infrastructure qualification. So no more, server hardware checks or backup and recovery checks and all of that. All of that is part of your infrastructure qualification, and you're purely focusing only on the application, how, what the requirements for the application are, and, how you go about testing that application. You can, with virtualization, you can even outsource testing and document development. So, say you hire a consulting company who also has a VM environment, right? So you can actually spin up your application, whether it's your, Oracle e-business suite. You can just get the entire environment onto a few files, ship it across to your consultant, and make them develop those documents, and without ever spending a dime on travel dollars, without ever spending a dime on providing access to your production system and all of that stuff. You can also even do destructive testing, meaning you can take an image, set it up in a different environment, and you can do a lot of destructive testing to really truly try and break the system, which you will not tend to do if you have a physical box and only a few environments that you can play with. Ongoing validation costs can also be simplified. because now you can take a lot more risks, because you can always roll back to a particular point in time in a matter of minutes. So the extent of validation or the extent of testing can also be reduced because you can tend to take more risks, saying, hey, at any point in time I can always go back and always roll back. All I have to do is go look at my backup, restore the database, and I'm at my current state, but at the old configuration. So therefore, you can kind of simplify the extent of validation that you can do for your application. And of course, from a contingency planning or a disaster recovery perspective, the costs are significantly lower as well. Of course, you may have to invest in certain physical infrastructure items like SAN, and maybe you want to do replication. Maybe you want to have a redundant data center, and you might have to invest some money in that, depending on the kind of availability you want, the kind of disaster recovery you want, or your recovery time objective or your recovery point objective. But once that is really set in place, you can really do a lot more on a virtual environment than you can in a physical environment.